Hello everyone, welcome to the second session of today's Design Talks program. We're here to discuss women in design and creating a culture of equality. I won't do half as good a job of introducing our speakers as they will themselves, so if you could perhaps say a few words about yourself and your organisation, what it is that you do.
Does this work? Yes. I'm Tina Norden. I'm a partner at Conran and Partners. We are a multidisciplinary practice working across kind of architecture, master planning and interior design.
I'm Constantina Tsoutsikou. I was creative director at HBA up until last month, and I've dived to the other side, being an independent creative.
Hi, I'm Sam Crocker. I'm the founder of Especial, which is one of the leading food service and procurement consultancies in the F&B industry.
Great, so you have each had quite different journeys to success. Tina, of course, as a partner at Conran, Constantina with HBN now branching off and doing your own thing, and Sam as the CEO of Especial. So I'm wondering, to start, if each of you can perhaps talk a little bit about your journey within the design world and how you have come to be in the position that you are now.
Pretty linear, I have to say. Incredibly boring, because I've always wanted to be an architect. I wanted to be a diplomat and then an architect, but nonetheless, always wanted to be an architect. And that's what I did. It's a very long course. It's quite an involved course. And I've never worked anywhere else but at Conran and Partners, so how boring is that? But, you know, joking aside, I think it's definitely a path that kind of was set off by a number of things. My father was a landscape architect, and my parents have always encouraged us to do whatever we wanted to do, no matter what that is. And I think that's a very important starting point to give young women and young men, no matter what, you can do whatever you want. If you want to be a hairdresser, be a hairdresser. You want to be an architect, be an architect. And that was the same in my school. There was never a kind of gender assignment that you shouldn't be doing certain things because you're a girl or because you're a boy. And I think that was very important. It was more a case of saying, well, you want to be an architect, you better do some physics and some maths in your A-levels. So, which is the right kind of encouragement you should be getting. And I think part of the reason why I stayed at Conran for so long is because gender has never really been an issue. And it still isn't today. And I think we've got a very good gender balance, and that's something we're really proud of.
I came to London to do a master's in design for the environment. And then I graduated, and I kind of traveled between Athens and London for a while before I decided to try it out here. So I kind of arrived in London with, a suitcase, you would say, full of ambition, without really knowing the design world. So I didn't know, who the players were or, what the right thing to do is. So it was a little bit like kind of finding your path in the dark. But I worked hard, and I was, fortunate to stumble in a company that I joined, 14 years ago as a designer, and worked my way up to be creative director and lead the studio. And I've never really, in that kind of journey, we were just talking with Tina just a moment ago, I never really in that journey thought about, I'm doing this and I'm a woman. It was always just, of course, there was never really a question or any kind of difficulty there. But I do think it's a good time. Well, I'm independent now, and I think it's a good time, and it's never been better to be an independent and to be a woman in design.
So I've always been an entrepreneur. I started my first business when I was 19 in a totally different sector, which was actually in fire consultancy. So don't ask why I'm now in design, but putting out fires was my thing. But I had kids very young, actually very, very young. And I chose to give them a few years, so I actually left that. And after about 3 years after my youngest was born, I decided that I wanted to get back into work. And rather than go and set something up on my own, I found myself in a very short stint in recruitment, and then in a catering equipment suppliers company as business development director. And it was a great experience. We've all dealt with companies, I'm sure, that run by catalogues, and you as a customer go and say, well, that's the item I want, give them a code and they'll deliver. But for me, it didn't satisfy service or innovation or creativity, which for some reason has always been in me. So I decided to, after about 5 years of working for them, to set up my own business again. And my little utility room became my little warehouse, and my 2 children, which were very tolerant at the time. It was all a big family, and we've grown over the last 20 years, and I've now got 12,000 square foot of warehousing, employ a whole load of people, and have gone from strength to strength. So it's been an interesting journey, slightly different, maybe less tinged with the gender issues, but we'll come on to that later. So that's my journey.
So if I may say, each of you are really at the top of your game, and you're also each in positions of authority. Do you think for women the professional world becomes easier to navigate once you've reached a certain position of seniority, or does it simply throw up a whole other set of obstacles?
Well, I mean, frankly, being the boss always helps because you have a certain amount of authority, which people just have to follow. But you know, slightly less facetiously, I think there are certain things that you do come across. Like, for example, you don't really hear people being called a kind of, a bitch, you know, if they're male, you know, but, you know, a hard bitch is probably something that female executives do get. And, you know, that's not really kind of levied out as much at males because they're kind of expected to be very, you know, authoritative, etc. So I think there's probably certain things that, you know, as a woman, you're maybe judged a little bit harsher at times. And also another thing that we were talking about earlier is that I think sometimes as women we have to watch also not being that bitch towards your other females in the office. Because they're going through exactly that same thing, and I think we need to all support each other. And those kind of little fights and kind of animosities that can sometimes happen between females, we mustn't let that get in the way of letting other people thrive that are working with us.
I mean, I do think that if you are a woman in a certain level, you know, you have a lot of responsibility, you are a decision maker. I think the perception out there is that you must be strong and have a tough skin and all these things. But somehow, if you're a man, you kind of don't necessarily need that kind of profile. So I think sometimes being a man, you're almost halfway there. If you're in a top position, people don't question it so much. And sometimes there is a little bit of surprise, maybe. Sometimes. So that's something we need to change, you know, that how we perceive, you know, power, how we perceive women in power, and what do we expect from them?
I agree with your comments. I think when you reach a certain point in your career, doors are much more easily opened, and respect is to a certain extent given. In my journey over the last 20 years, I think certainly from being in a room perspective where sometimes I was the only female, I think that made me maybe want to prove myself more and show that actually we can, you know, I can do it and I can deliver, and then it's not the automatic boys club scenario that we've all experienced, I'm sure. You know, that there is a sense that you perhaps myself anyway, I strive harder, but I've never once sort of felt that I'm secondary in any scenario. So I think, you know, being in a position of authority with your team members, etc., it is important that you show them that as well and give them the encouragement that they can do whatever they feel that they want to do.
And you still see the term glass ceiling being bandied about every now and again. And for me, it feels like quite an outmoded term. But then, of course, it would, because I don't know any difference. Do you think that the term glass ceiling is now an irrelevance? Is there still this idea that there's a kind of cap on just how far a woman can ascend professionally within the design world?
I think we're quite lucky in design that we are generally quite an open and maybe more kind of inclusive industry. Personally, I've never felt a glass ceiling because I'm a woman. I think it was more to do with, you know, ability and you know, being able to fulfill a position. I don't think I can judge whether that's the case everywhere, because I think it varies greatly depending on what type of practice you might be working on, and certainly in a more corporate field there's probably more of that around still. And in other industries, I mean, you know, first female American president, anyone? I mean, there's things like that where there's definitely still probably a much stronger element of that. But, I think in the design industry, it's hopefully much more nowadays about ability and about actually being the right person for the job. But I think it varies greatly.
I agree. I think as designers, I think we have a pretty good representation. In other sectors, I mean, we come across, structural engineers and mechanical engineers and architects, and there I feel that there sometimes it's a lot harder to find women in leading positions, and there's less women generally. It's not like that they start and they're staying in a junior kind of level. I think just less women study those subjects. But I have to say that if there is a glass ceiling, and you may find it in certain companies or certain sectors, I guess women also have a choice whether to stay somewhere where they feel that may be the case, or just try a different route, because you can't always control, where you might end up or find yourself, but you can control what you do about it. And if you feel like there's no way through, any way to kind of reach where you want to get, it's worth just trying another environment altogether.
I think that's an interesting point about, in a way, accepting the context of something and then making a decision about whether you want to buy into that or not. You each work in quite an international capacity, and so I'm wondering if you think that how women are perceived in the design sphere varies depending on the culture in which you're working in. I mean, I know, for example, in the Middle East or in parts of Asia, certainly there's a very different perception of how women are in the workplace, and whether you also feel that when you go to those regions to work.
I have had some experience with this, and I do work overseas. I think it's, in any walk of life, it's really important to respect the culture you're in and how they generally do business. Running a business and being the founder of a business means that I'm able to choose where I go and what I do and the projects that we work on. But if I get really passionate about a project, or if I really want to do it, but I feel that the dynamic may be cultural or even just on a person-to-person basis, might mean that a different person, that could be a man or it could be another woman, is a better fit, then I will certainly work with that sense, because it is about business. So being overseas and working in different cultures, I believe you should respect that. And if you want to be there and you want to work out there, that's your choice. You don't have to if you don't want to. So.
I mean, I've had experience working in the Middle East and in China, for example. And, you go to these countries, you don't know what you're going to find. Sometimes there's, a boardroom full of, 40 people there, and sometimes it's stressful just to get to know who's who and what their role is on the project. So I think many times I've, gone in and, done my thing, and only towards the end of the, day meeting, you kind of realize and you go, and I'm actually the only woman in here. But I've also encountered, colleagues that would be kind of intimidated going out to meet do a project workshop in countries where heavily male-dominated. And that was an issue. So, for example, they wouldn't want to travel alone. They would want to go with someone together. It does depend on the individual, and again, the narrative. I would have none of that. I would not allow myself to be intimidated just because they're a different gender. But it does depend on the individual.
We work pretty much all across the globe, and I've had the great opportunity to work in many places across the world. And it's often quite surprising what you find. And I think you're absolutely right. If you go and work in a different country, I think you need to do that with open eyes. And you need to be very conscious of, cultural differences, how people approach things, just little things that might offend someone in a different country that is perfectly normal for us. But I've sat in meetings in Japan with 40 men and not a single woman. The only other woman being the one serving tea. And I've been in meetings in the Middle East and in Indonesia, in Muslim countries, where the structure engineer was a woman, the mechanical engineer was a woman, and the boss was a woman too. So I think, often we go in and we go, oh, I'm sure it's going to be like that. And it's really not like that at all. But I think as long as you're respectful and open and considerate to the people that you're working with, I think you can only really win.
And so it sounds like there's never really a temptation then to challenge the status quo if you find yourself perhaps in a slightly problematic situation. Is it one of those things that you do just think, well, maybe that's just somewhere I don't want to go and work then?
Everything is a choice. And I mean, sometimes that's easier said than done. Jobs come in and, you've got people's wages to pay and whatever. So it's not as easy to say, hey, I'm not going to be doing that. But, we still have a choice, and if something really doesn't feel right, then sometimes the most brave or the bravest choice is to walk away.
And how important is visibility then? I mean, it was actually really interesting that you touched upon being in places in the Middle East where you see other women in positions of authority in industries that might perhaps be quite male-dominated. Is visibility within the industry something that's quite important? And was it something that also perhaps affected your own development professionally, maybe seeing other women in positions of power, or conversely, not seeing other women in positions of power?
I think it's absolutely fundamental. I think there's a lot of discussion about that now for all sorts of different groups, to say that if you don't see someone who looks like you or speaks like you or whatever, then you doubt whether you're right for a profession. And I think that applies everywhere. Architecture is a very male-dominated industry. Construction even more so. So when I was studying in the 90s, apart from Zaha Hadid, there wasn't really many female role models of architects out there that were actually familiar names across the industry. And that certainly, you kind of go, oh, okay, that's interesting. And, why is that the case? So I think then when I was doing my master's, all of a sudden half of the tutors were female. And that makes a massive difference. All of a sudden, it's normal, that's fine. They're just like me, and they can do this and I can do this, and that's great. So I think it's really, really important, fundamental.
I agree, but I find myself as a bit of a pioneer as well. So I don't actually have that. I didn't ever feel I had that requirement to have a role model as such. I think for me, looking at people in business and what they've achieved and their ability to give back was how I learnt and how I got stronger and how I sort of almost broke down barriers, if there were any at the time. So as an entrepreneur, it's never having somebody sort of in a female sense, it's important obviously to have female role models, but I do think that it is about people in business generally and how they can actually enable you to learn and to move forward in your own career. So I've never had the sort of that issue in my path, shall we say.
I mean, I think of visibility in a different way too. So I think technology has allowed women to be more visible, and say, in the past 20 years, you wouldn't necessarily know what a company structure is or who's behind, key roles. And now you can just click on a website. You could see everything, the whole hierarchy is there. It's for everybody to look at. And now it's become really obvious why the top, it's usually mostly men. And then depending on where you are, you might have more representation of women or less. And how wrong it feels when it's very tipping towards one direction or another. But I also feel like women have found an audience because, again, technology has enabled them to kind of bypass what used to be an official kind of established path of communication. Say if you want to put your ideas out there or your work, you might have had to go through a magazine editor or a book publisher or whatever. And now anybody can do it from their bedroom or their kitchen table. They can, or social media has enabled women to just come out there and show what they're capable of, what they're thinking about, and what interests them. I was just thinking about two ladies that are now dressing in, everything is recycled or second-hand, and they're just wearing the same clothes throughout, the course of a month maybe, in different combinations. And it's just, wow, you can just do that from home and inspire so many other women about how we dress and what is sustainable and all these things.
So kind of sticking with the issue of visibility and representation, I was working on a project recently, and I won't name any names, but it involved a judging panel. And the person who was organising this opined that it was very difficult to create a balanced panel that had an equal number of women and an equal number of men, because in his, and of course it was a him, in his perception, there weren't enough women in senior roles in the design industry to create that even split. It's not something that I agree with, personally. And so why do you think that perception would persist with someone like that? Or is it actually not just a perception and somehow grounded in reality?
I think you might need to check his address book, really.
I know a few good ones.
He needs to address his business.
I think that, well, I mean, the perception, obviously, how people perceive things depends very much on what they expose themselves to. So I think if you look around, I mean, I've been to so many panels and so many events and whatever, and, there's certainly no lack of females that are, articulate, intelligent, have a great reputation in the industry and whatever. So I think that's an excuse, frankly.
On the other hand, if you were selected to join a project or a panel or something, just for the sake of doing, a kind of balanced, if you're like a token female, I would find that quite insulting.
You're not that great, but you're female, so that's
fine. We need to tick this box.
So what are your thoughts then on the notion of women being given a leg up, which is somehow it's slightly offensively described when it comes to the introduction of, say, quotas, where we're saying that we need to have mixed boardrooms? A, do you agree with that philosophy that we should be making conscious decisions to ensure that there is equal representation in forums like that? And how do you feel about it being sometimes described as a leg up or somehow being given special dispensation?
Well, I shan't answer the first bit because you can probably guess what I'm going to say. Balance is really important in any business and for a business. So I think that it's important that employers understand working culture and how diverse teams create perhaps the best results at the end of the day. It is important that the right person is chosen for a role, and actually, controversially, I'm probably going to say that for maybe 10 years of my business life, I actually couldn't find a man to work with. That balance has now changed, thankfully. Probably I've grown up. But it was actually the other way around for a long time for me. But I think it is about working culture and making sure that the people that work for you feel empowered and they feel that they can achieve anything they want to. That I'm lucky that a lot of people who have joined my team are still with me. But there have been people that have gone out into the industry and done really, really well and will chart the course for, young women, let's say, and that's actually really important. So that's, I think, probably how diversity is going to come into play. But, yeah.
I've always been really uncomfortable with the notion of anything being done specifically to support anyone, I guess, because it should really be about ability and being the right person for whatever the task at hand is. But conversely, I also think that, maybe there are people out there that are more vulnerable, maybe come from a background where that encouragement is not been there from an early age, where maybe a little nudge to help them on their way would really help. But I would advocate that more in the early stages, in school, at universities, junior designers coming into a practice, rather than maybe later when you should really be trying to stand on your own legs and forge your own path based on your capabilities and your abilities, rather than just about your gender or whatever it might be. So I think it's a very difficult issue, because you don't ever want to be accused of just being where you are because of your gender, because of whatever else you can't do anything about. But I guess with gender you can nowadays. But anyway, but still, just completely saying, okay, there shouldn't be any help for young females, or indeed, people from other, more vulnerable groups or whatever it might be, is probably a little bit harsh. So I think it's something that needs to be approached very carefully and right for the age level, for the experience level, and all of that kind of stuff.
Do you think women in a way are in a special position to help perhaps minorities within the workplace, because there, if not so much today, certainly in the past, has maybe been a sense of an unequal treatment? That means there's perhaps a greater understanding of having to address a historic imbalance that might now perhaps be more applicable to those from minority communities more than women?
I think so, and I think a big part of it is communication. So being able to really put out there what it is that you're looking for and you want. Because I think sometimes men are better at vocalizing with their ambition and what they want rather than women. We can be sometimes a little bit too considerate or kind of a little bit more... we don't want to upset the order sometimes, too accommodating is the word I was looking for. And men, I feel sometimes they don't really care about all these things. They just go for it. And if women could do that too, it would be a lot better, and minorities. So I think the first step, and I think junior designers and younger people are better than I guess we were at vocalizing what they want. They are able to say what they're looking for. And where they need to be. And I think progressively, with all these conversations that are being made now, it will be easier for them.
And then inequality, despite the fact that women often feel the negative repercussions of that, isn't fundamentally a women's issue. It's an issue for everyone. So to what degree does the onus lie on women to affect change?
I think it's for everybody, not just women. But we are a force, and I think because we've been in a position where I think we're in a world that has been male-dominated for centuries and centuries and centuries, and just now, things are changing and things are getting better. I think the world is opening up to a different way of doing things. So you will still have those, the clubs of white, male, Western men that have got a lot of influence. But it doesn't mean that, there can't be other clubs of influence of different people that could be, women and minorities and different genders, nationalities, and what have you.
What I've always tried to tell, young designers coming into the office, early stages in their career, no matter who they are and what they are, but particularly young females, you are a woman, you are whatever it is that you are, use it for your advantage. So I've always felt that, if you're on a building site and it's basically a whole bunch of usually male builders that are a bit rough and tumble and whatever, hey, you're a pretty young female, or even if you're not that pretty, it doesn't really matter, but you're a female on site. You're a completely different force. So you can actually interact with the guys on site in a completely different way. I've always thought, well, I'm going to try and get around them like I got around my dad back in the old days, So I think you can use, whatever your background is, whoever you are, to your advantage in a positive way. So, whether it's kind of, saying, oh, but you would do that for me, wouldn't you, type thing, and then they don't have that alpha male thing going around and say, well, I can't really do that, whatever. So I think it's trying to use who you are and trying to kind of make the best out of that and try and kind of, forge your way to your best abilities and to what's been given to you.
So yes to all of that, but I'm probably going to relay this question a bit more to the working culture of an organisation, and being a woman at the top has enabled me to show other young ladies in my organisation that it's okay. I have had 2 children. I couldn't just leave my business. You work through it. You get through it. And for me, enabling the ladies that come in, and indeed men. The other day I have an employee, he phoned me up, he said, well, my 2 twins are ill, I can't work. I'm like, don't worry about it, just work from home. It doesn't actually matter what gender you are these days, it's actually about a culture. So the onus is on everyone to create change, and it's on working practices and not on this outdated perhaps 9 to 5 or where do you live or you have to come into an office, because actually the world doesn't work like that anymore. And I think the more that people can relax on and support their employees, if you've got people who want to work for you and they're invested in you, that is the most fundamental thing to create success in any business, because they are your future. And if you work with them, regardless of gender, you are going to have the best outcome.
And it's interesting that you touch upon family life. This is the last question from me, and then we'll open it up to the audience. And I'm almost loath to ask this, because it is a topic that inevitably seems to get asked to women much more than men. But I know, even from my sister recently, and a lot of the difficulties that she had even in management with her employer, having just had a child, and the inflexibility that meant she ended up having to leave that company. You know, how do you, I don't want to say how do you balance that, but what is it that needs to change in the industry to actually take account of sometimes those unique challenges that will sometimes face women in terms of the choices of how to balance family life with a career?
I mean, just to throw some statistics out there, but, you know, when I was at university, it's about 50-50 male-female. And as you go through part 1, part 2, part 3, and working as an architect, somehow it drops to 17%. So something happens along the way as women grow up in the profession that means that they're dropping out. Now, okay, this is counting qualified architects, but nonetheless, I think it's a shocking statistic. And, you know, when there are you know, people asking around in the industry why that might be, you know, the statistics say it's largely down to the inability of accommodating family life in the industry, because it's long working hours, you know, people are expected to be there all the time, expected to be on call all the time, you know, working on weekends, whatever it might be, which is not very flexible towards someone having a family. And that, you rightly say, male or female, but unfortunately quite often it does fall on the female still. So I think the one thing we can do in the industry is to facilitate those incredibly talented young women and men to stay in the industry when they want to plan a family, is to actually accommodate that. And what we've found is we've got a very, very flexible arrangement with people having family. We have a lot of people working part-time, you know, whatever it might be. From my experience, most people working part-time because of family, they actually pretty much do a full-time job because they really want to prove themselves. They want to show that they can still do it, but they do it in half the time. So, you know, hats off to them and how they manage to do that. And we've always felt that we got, you know, twice as much back as we put in by giving people that opportunity. And I think that's what we need to do, is give people the opportunity to actually do both of those, create a way of, you know, working part-time, working from home, whatever it might be. There's always a way around it. And as long as you structure that properly and you trust people to be grown up and to do their job, whether they're sitting at their desk or not, you know, and for some mums, it's just easier to do it at 11 o'clock at night when the kids are in bed. You know, they need to leave at 4, but they can do another couple of hours between, you know, 9 and 11. That's fine. It doesn't really matter as long as they know when they need to be in the office and we can plan meetings around it and whatever. But, you know, ultimately it's about creating that environment where that is okay.
I agree. I mean, I have children. And the thing is, it's really important, and I can't stress how important it is to get to, say, quite high up, is the ability to have a relationship with the industry at all times. So, you know, when you're having, you know, babies and kids, like, instead of, if you take the time out and you say 5 years out or 10 years out, it's so detrimental what it does to your career, because then by the time you come back, you kind of return to where you left it, which is, you know, people are 10 years younger than you. You're competing with a whole different kind of dynamics. So it's imperative that you do stay in touch, and there are, you know, systems there to enable you to be flexible, whether you work from home, whether you do part-time, but you're still doing something. You're still part of the conversation and you're developing yourself. So that's really important. And I think there's not enough of that. And I think there's not enough of systems like, you know, nurseries there, or, you know, I never understood why companies just don't get together, you know, in a neighborhood, you know, 5 companies, you know, between them, I'm sure there's enough, you know, kids or babies that need to be looked after early on before they go to school, because that's the hardest part, right? To just team together and say, right, let's just start like a daycare center and provide, because it's really difficult. It really is. It's so hard. It's so hard to have, you know, trying to do both.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I've said a lot of answers to this question, but perhaps one final thing is, I mean, looking forward, things are shifting in the industry, and paternity leave is now really, I would imagine, going to help the male-female shift in terms of who does most of it with the extended paternity availability. So that should hopefully start to balance out the childcare issues that anyone with children face.
Does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask our speakers?
My question is about mentoring or networking within the industry, so women in the built environment. How do you think is that happening enough? Women mentoring other women, which doesn't necessarily mean somebody more senior mentoring somebody more junior, but it can be your peer within the same company, in another company, maybe, or just giving advice. I mean, there's NAWIC, women in construction, but I don't know of any other. So do you think that's enough, or do you think there's room for more networking geared towards women in the industry?
There's NEWH, which is Women in Hospitality. They also allow men, so it's it's nicely balanced. But I think there could always be more. Surely there could always be more in mentoring.
And I think maybe that's another one where maybe we shouldn't split the mentoring of just young females, but just generally young people coming in the office, because in many ways that is the whole culture of the office, and that's everybody involved in how they deal with each other. So we really try and kind of get people, into the fold by saying, oh, you're working with this person, they're a little bit more experienced, they can show you the ropes, they can show you how things are done, and also saying, actually, you know what, I sit at my desk, we don't have offices or whatever it is. If I'm there, you come and ask, and that's fine. Whoever you are, that's fine. And being very democratic in our decision-making process, in our design process. If our work placement student has a great idea for a project, that's just as valid as mine might be. And it's important to encourage that people feel they can speak up at any one point, certainly in internal meetings, and equally so in consultant meetings, whatever, if they have a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, obviously not coming from a corporate sector, it's difficult. From my perspective, I try and mentor all of my team and enable them also, when I've got new people coming into the business, to take those roles so that they can show young people what their experience has been and to enable them to move forward. But I mean, in women in business, I'm sure there's loads of mentoring. The IOD is probably quite a good Institute of Directors. It's probably quite a good organisation to look at, because they offer mentoring for anyone in any sector.
Well, if we have no other questions, we do. Keeping me fit today.
Hiya. All three of you are decision makers on who get hired into your team. When you're at interview or CV stage possibly, is intersectionality, so women of minority, or if you've got less men in the office, it might be hiring more men, is that part of your decision making when hiring someone? Are you trying to represent a balanced office when you have that vacancy?
I mean, to be honest, the most crucial aspect for us is that person right for the position. Have they got the right credentials? Are they the right personality to fit into the studio? Are they, have they got the right kind of experience, etc.? That's of utmost importance for us. Unfortunately, the people that actually even send in CVs and are in the industry are often not as varied as we would like it to be. And that's unfortunately a fact that is very difficult for us to change. And we'd hope that, people feel like they can apply for us no matter what their background is, as long as they feel like they've got the right credentials. But, it is a fact of the matter that most of the applications we get in interior design are females. We're actually struggling to get more male interior designers in the practice. And it's also fair to say that particularly in architecture, ethnic minorities are not very well represented. When I was at university in my undergraduate, I could count the faces that were not Caucasian white almost on one hand amongst 100 people. And that's, that is a whole other aspect, that's a whole other panel to talk about, how you can get more, more diversity into the industry. But at the moment, it's not that great yet. So, unfortunately, it's much more monochromatic what we get in terms of CVs already.
I agree. I mean, it's always, who is right for the job, and it doesn't matter sometimes even how old they are or what gender or anything. But it has been hard to get, guys. And we've had conversations where it's like, we could do with a little bit more balance. It will just be more interesting from a social perspective too for the office, and also not just the job itself, but how do people mix? What are the dynamics of personalities? It's good, I think, to have, people that sometimes can be more, calming, or in a high stress environment. Those dynamics really affect the way the office can go one way or another.
Yeah, I agree. There's not much more to add to that, really. There have been times where I've gone, please, can you send a man through the door so I can find balance? But it is about who's right for the role. So.
Great, so a quick plug. We're back here in about 45... Oh, we've got more.
Thank you for the nice talk. Just a question, please. Like, as a woman, in one word, what makes you outstanding and successful in the market or in your field?
No barriers.
Being open to the world, the people, just being really receptive.
Maybe compassion. I think that's a good word.
Great, so we're back here in about 45 minutes talking about multi-purpose spaces. So enjoy your lunch, and if you can join me in saying thank you to our panelists, Tina, Constantina, and Sam. Thank you.